Good morning. I'm Mary Moglia-Cannon, your service leader. We are joined by Jeremy Johnchik on AV and Madeline Hartz on piano. In honor of Earth Day, UUEA invited Adam Rome to return. For those who don't know Dr. Rome, he is a professor of environment and sustainability at the University of Buffalo. He's the leading expert on the history of environmental activism. He is author of The Genius of Earth Day, How a 1970 Teach-In Unexpectedly Made the First Green Generation. From his book, he created an Audible original course, The Genius of Earth Day. Adam is also author of the prize-winning Bulldozer in the Countryside, Suburban, Sprawl, and the Rise of American Environmentalism, and co-editor of Green Capitalism, Business and the Environment in the 20th Century. He's generous enough to provide us with a Q&A, which will come after the service closes out, but in the sanctuary before coffee hour. Here is Dr. Adam Rome with inspiration for us as we seek to address the challenges of our time. Thank you, Dr. Rome.
Thank you, Mary. And yes, I Zoomed with you all before, but this is my first time actually with you on Sunday and in person, which is quite remarkable for me. I realized as I was listening to the beautiful music and seeing the wonderful videos and hearing the great readings that having had, I would say, a mostly secular upbringing, I haven't really had the experience very often of being with people weekly on a Sunday. So this is wonderful. I am really hoping to inspire today, actually. Looking ahead, April 22nd, Earth Day. The first Earth Day was in 1970. And it's, many of you will remember that time. We had, as a nation, done almost nothing, really, to address environmental problems. We had serious air pollution, we had serious water pollution. No one regulated what people did with hazardous waste. Trash was piling up, not just in landfills, but all over the place. You could float down rivers and see junked cars on the riverbanks, along with a lot of other debris. And Earth Day was the idea of a U.S. senator from Wisconsin, Gaylord Nelson, who's one of my heroes. And he'd been governor before. And when he was governor, he'd begun to be interested in environmental issues, to think of them as one of the most critical things that we faced at the time. And by 1970, there were many people that wondered whether we would survive as a civilization. Pollution was so obviously getting worse, in so many ways endangering human lives, but also the lives of every other living thing on the planet. And Gaylord Nelson had tried, after he got elected to the Senate in 1963, in a variety of ways, first to get the president seriously interested in environmental issues, then to get Congress seriously interested. None of that worked. And then in 1969, he, after having flown out to California, where he saw months after the first of what's unfortunately a series of devastating oil spills in U.S. history in Santa Barbara, he was reading something on the plane about protest against the Vietnam War, which was still going on in 1969. And a few years before, mostly young people, some professors, mostly students on a variety of campuses, maybe 50 altogether, had what they called teach-ins on the Vietnam War. And it was bringing people who supported the war together with people who opposed the war as an extracurricular, politicized educational event, usually in the evenings, and sometimes it lasted all evening into the early morning. And the organizers were opposed to the war, and they were convinced that if people saw a real debate about the war, they would come out opposed. And Gaylord Nelson thought this had really energized young people and led to other more sustained kinds of anti-war activism and protest in the later 60s. And he thought the same thing could happen on environmental issues, that young people might be able to do what Congress hadn't, what the president hadn't, what business hadn't, what no one really had done, which was to put environmental issues at the top of the national agenda. So in September 1969, he promised that he would organize a nationwide environmental teach-in in April of 1970. And nothing like this had ever happened. There had been no mass demonstrations on environmental issues, unlike with civil rights, unlike with the anti-war movement, where there had been many throughout the decade. And you know, it's odd. Gaylord Nelson was 53, balding. He's not exactly the person that you would think to start a mass movement that would ultimately draw, by some estimates, 20 million Americans in April 1970. And that was an eighth of the population. It's an astonishing number. Virtually every elementary school in the country had some kind of, and junior high and high school, some kind of Earth Day event. Virtually every college and university had some kind of event. Many places of worship that weekend had sermons or other programs about environmental issues, and nothing like that had happened before. And when I worked on the book, people had always recognized that Earth Day was an incredible demonstration, the biggest demonstration in American history of people caring about an issue. And the media also gave it tremendous attention. PBS was brand new then. They devoted their whole day. Even Sesame Street had an environmental theme that day. Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood had an environmental theme. But the other networks, and there only were 3 other networks then, ABC, NBC, and CBS, they all had nighttime, primetime specials on Earth Day. Almost every magazine, again, many of these are now gone, or people don't read them anymore, but you know, Time, Newsweek, U.S. News and World Report, even Sports Illustrated had a cover story about the environment. And again, none of that had ever happened before. But what I found out when I worked on this book was that Earth Day created a lasting, what I call eco-infrastructure. All kinds of environmental groups formed. Many of them were just continuations of the ad hoc groups that formed to make Earth Day happen. I left out a critical detail. So Gaylord Nelson had the idea, but he was willing to have anyone who wanted to organize an Earth Day event, and they could do anything on Earth Day or Earth Week, as many people celebrated it, that they wanted to. He was advised to have a very hierarchical top-down thing, and he rejected that. He realized this was brilliant, that if he let anyone who wanted to do it and do whatever they wanted, they would take ownership of it in a way that was not possible if he told them exactly, this is what Earth Day is, this is what you need to do. And tens of thousands of people around the country organized Earth Day events. Some Earth Day events were organized by only a handful of people, some by hundreds of people. And again, that included school-age kids, college kids, 30-somethings, but also some older people as well. And out of that organizing effort came a lot of new environmental organizations that continued to be very important. There had really been no environmental lobbying organizations before. There really were only a handful of national environmental organizations, and most of them only focused on a few particular issues. But the media also realized this was a big thing. Lots of newspapers created beats. They assigned a person regularly to cover environmental issues. Before Earth Day, there were only, I think, 3 people that did that in the whole country. Within 6 months, there were over 100, and it continued to grow. That now there's a society of environmental journalists that has several thousand members. That all goes back to Earth Day. People created local community centers. They called them ecology centers. And they often started recycling. At the time, no one recycled. It was very hard to, even if you wanted to, find anybody to take your paper or your cans or your plastic. And those ecology centers were like secular churches of environmentalism. You could go for fellowship, for inspiration, to find the latest news, and to be with other people that shared your concerns. Bookstores started having environmental sections, and publishers published hundreds and hundreds of books. One that was created just for Earth Day, just called the Environmental Handbook, sold more than 1 million copies just from January 1970 to April 1970 when Earth Day was held. And publishers said, wow, people care. So that became a thing for publishers, eco-publishing. But the most important legacy, I would think, wasn't just the institutional, and colleges created, and many schools, environmental studies programs or courses. But many, many individuals, thousands and thousands of individuals, were inspired to go and try to make a difference. In some cases, they did that in their private life, but many of them did it by changing the work that they did or the volunteer work that they did. And they pioneered all kinds of new environmental niches. They became environmental lawyers or environmental architects or environmental journalists, or they started environmental organizations, or they went to work for the new environmental agencies. There was no EPA before 1970, not just no national one, no New York one, no other state had an environmental protection agency. People were entrepreneurial, not in a money-making sense necessarily, but they had to create the opportunities, the jobs, the work, the volunteer activities that they wanted to do. And I ended up profiling a whole bunch of people who did everything from start a bookstore that featured environmental books and also devoted a share of the profits to environmental causes. So it was a not-for-profit bookstore in Massachusetts, or created, radio programs on the environment. But I wanted to read you from my Audible original, my favorite story of someone who was inspired to do something that she never planned to do as a result of Earth Day. Dorothy Bradley decided on the first Earth Day to seek election to the Montana House of Representatives. She was just a year out of college, and she had never imagined running for office. But her work as one of the organizers of Bozeman's Earth Day celebration fired her up. What would she do next? At a party that night for Earth Day organizers and speakers, a leader of the State League of Women Voters suggested that Bradley run for a seat in the legislature. A state senator seconded the suggestion. Bradley had 3 strikes against her, the senator said. She was only 23. She was a woman seeking to enter a man's world. There were literally no women in the legislature at the time. And she was a Democrat in a Republican county. But what did she have to lose, he said. The filing deadline was the next day, and Bradley had to fill out the paperwork in person at the state capitol in Helena, which was 100 miles away. I drove my beat-up VW with my dog. She was wearing blue jeans, and her hair was in pigtails. And when she got to the clerk was startled. "Dear, are you old enough?" Bradley saw her campaign as a way to sustain the spirit of Earth Day. She wanted to raise fundamental questions about our relationship to the environment. Her spiritual platform, she said, was Aldo Leopold's classic work of environmental philosophy, A Sand County Almanac. In Leopold's view, humans needed to develop a land ethic, that was his phrase, a land ethic to guide our interactions with nature. And Bradley repeatedly made that argument to voters. I don't think people should be allowed to abuse the land any more than they're allowed to abuse their children, she explained. The morals of a community should extend to the whole land. The mechanics of Bradley's campaign fit her beliefs. Instead of advertising on billboards and placards, she gave away litter bags, actually plastic litter bags, she sent me one of them, that people could put in their cars. And they were meant to make people chuckle, but also think. On one side, in gargantuan letters, it said, "Dorothy is for the birds, and the elk, and the bears, and the flowers, and for Montana." On the other side was a checklist for action. Bike or carpool, wash clothes and dishes with low-phosphate detergents, avoid DDT. And then the message, to keep Montana beautiful, it's up to you. Her fundraising also was unconventional. She had a garage sale. By giving old goods new life, her supporters conserved resources. Needless to say, she had to meet a lot of skepticism. One observer dismissed her as a glib hippie kid. Another thought her speeches were too intellectual. But Bradley had strong support in the Montana State University community. She also appealed to hunting and fishing enthusiasts. And on election day, she stunned the pundits. Everything was wrong, but she won, one newspaper wrote. Everything was wrong, but she won. That was an incredible headline. Bradley saw her victory as a sign of the timeliness of her agenda. "I was so outspoken, it was incredible," she told me. "The people were ready for a strong environmental pitch." And I won't take the time to tell you all the things that she did in the legislature, but she immediately made a difference dealing with a coal boom in Montana and whether the state was going to regulate not just the coal mining, but all the electric utility construction that was going to take advantage of that coal to produce power for the whole region. She played a really crucial role as a 23-year-old in the legislature in getting serious action on those issues. And she ended up serving in the legislature quite a few years and almost became the first female governor of Montana. She lost by a few thousand votes. And then she reverted to environmental work. She worked for a water center. She did a variety of other issues, worked on a variety of other issues. And I think for me, and again, she never intended to go into politics. She had no interest in politics before Earth Day. And for me, I think her decision to change her mind perfectly illustrates one of the reasons why Earth Day was so transformative. Earth Day did not just give people a new sense of mission. For many organizers of Earth Day events, the effort was empowering. Like Bradley, they gained the confidence and skills and contacts they needed to make a difference. And I continue to think about that because this was really part of Gaylord Nelson's genius. That, of course, he was an elected official, so he wanted to pass legislation, and he was hoping that Earth Day would build momentum, which it did for the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act and all the other important environmental initiatives that came after Earth Day in the early 1970s. But he understood, Gaylord Nelson, that environmental problems required a lot more than just legislation. There were all kinds of other ways that people might make a difference, and not just today and tomorrow and next week and next year, but like many people, he thought it would take at least a generation to address all the problems. And then in 1995, he started thinking, by which time climate change had become an issue, biodiversity had become an issue, that the real challenge was building a sustainable society. It wasn't just passing laws or dealing with one problem or another problem. It was really trying to reimagine our whole society to make it environmentally sustainable and just, I think he would have also said. And he thought that would take maybe 50 more years, so that gives us till 2045, if he's right. Building a sustainable society requires all kinds of different work. As I was, right around the time that Mary asked me if I would speak again, or reminded me that I had said yes, actually. She asked me months and months and months ago. I got an email from somebody in his late 60s, I would say, who had been a journalist, and then he'd worked for an environmental organization. He was working on a book. He's working on a book right now that his tentative title, which I hate, actually, was Not Okay Boomers. And so he's playing off a phrase There are a lot of young climate activists now. That's where almost all the energy on climate activism is coming from, is very young people. And some of them have gotten quite impatient with people of the boomer generation saying, not only are you not helping us now, but you are responsible for much of the problem that we've inherited. And so this guy is writing a book about boomers and climate change. And he had read my Earth Day book, and he wanted to talk about it. And it was a weird conversation at the beginning because I didn't share his premise. I didn't have this sense that boomers have let us down. First of all, not all boomers were hipsters and radicals back in the 60s. Some were quite conservative. They haven't changed. That's just who they were then, and it's who they are now. But I also don't think that a lot of boomers have just given up in the way that he seems to. Almost everybody that I interviewed for my book, they were still working on these issues decades after Earth Day, and that was incredibly inspiring to me. But as we talked, he was trying to figure out what more could boomers do than they've been doing. And he had various ideas. Some were pretty radical, actually. He said, I don't think I personally have the courage to do this, but maybe we need to start sabotaging fossil fuel facilities. And that idea is actually getting talked about in a mainstream way in the last 6 months or so. To me, that's horrifying, but it's astonishing that there are so many people that are now willing to talk about that out loud. But as we were talking, I said, no, that's not what I would think of. And even though I don't share your sense that the boomers have just as a generation let us down, boomers could feel young again if they acted more like some of the people like Dorothy Bradley. I mean, Dorothy Bradley didn't have much to lose. She hadn't started a career. She didn't have a family. She didn't have a mortgage. She could try things out and hope they worked, and they did work, and she made a huge difference. And I said, many boomers are in the same position. Their kids are long adult. Their mortgages probably paid off. They might be retired, but with, money more than they need. And they could imagine, starting again and doing something really serious, whatever that is, to make a difference. And he was, even though the whole conversation for him was troubling, that idea really hit home. He said, oh, that's really great. You can feel young again by finding new ways to make a difference as an environmental activist. Broadly defined, not necessarily marching in the streets or getting arrested, but doing whatever it takes. And as an example of that, I've been thinking a lot about business and how business could be more sustainable. And there are a lot of business leaders that are thinking about this, although my own view is they'll never be able to be sustainable unless the rest of us as citizens and consumers change the rules that business has to work by. But another one of my heroes was a man named Ray Anderson, who had started a carpet company about a couple years after Earth Day, 1973. And he's, as far as you can imagine, most of us at least, of what you call an environmentalist. He's kind of a very southern, good old boy, went to Georgia Tech, played football. He was an engineer, very competitive guy. This is all the way he would describe himself. And built up this company to become the leading manufacturer of carpet for commercial and institutional customers in the country. But when he was 60, at a time when he otherwise might have started to be thinking about, slowing down, handing over the company to somebody else, retiring, some of the people working for his company said, we have customers out on the West Coast that are beginning to ask, what are you guys doing about the environment? What's your environmental, principles? And Ray Anderson said, well, I've never even thought about that. Other than obey the law, comply with the law. If it says we can't dump this there, we won't dump this there. But, that's the extent of my environmental thinking. So a group got together and they organized to discuss this. And they realized wouldn't be worth it to keep going unless they got him to engage. And they asked him if he would give a speech to the group. And he said, I had no interest in giving a speech to the group. I didn't know anything about this, but I agreed to do it. And on short order, I had to come up with something to say. And someone gave him a book. It's a wonderful book. It's still incredibly inspiring, by Paul Hawken, called The Ecology of Commerce. And it's one sentence version of what Paul Hawken says in The Ecology of Commerce is, business is ruining the world, but it's the most transformative force in the world, so we can't save the world if we don't get business somehow to help. And Ray Anderson read this book, pushed on him by one of his staff, and he described it as a spear in the chest. He said, I suddenly realized this company that I've been so proud of was raping the earth, was destroying the earth. The carpet was made out of fossil fuels. The carpet itself and the glues and everything else had toxic elements. The way the fossil fuels were turned into fabric was full of hazards. And he has this epiphanal moment, is the phrase that he used. I bet in private he calls it a road to Damascus experience, because I think he was quite religious too. But he had this epiphanal moment when he suddenly realized, everything I've been doing in the future will be criminal. Everything I'm doing is wrong. And I'm going to dedicate the rest of my life to seeing if my company can be a model of sustainability. And the metaphor that he used was, we'll climb Mount Sustainability. And it's higher than Everest. It's going to be incredibly hard. We're going to have any number of accidents along the way and slip back down. But he was hoping that if he could do this at his company, other companies would also see that it was possible. Other companies would start thinking about it. And he did become kind of a rock star, that people were inspired by what his company was able to do, and is still doing. He died, I think, in 2011 or 12, but by then the company had become so thoroughly imbued with the spirit of sustainability that they have continued. And he thought it would take 25 years from 1995 or so, when he had really figured it out, until 2020 was his hope. As 2020 started looming larger, he said, well, I'd settle for 2021 or 2022. But still, it's remarkable. And it's amazing to me that he's become my hero, because I had no interest in business when I was younger. They were the bad guys. They were the polluters. But Ray Anderson has done amazing things. And again, he didn't start till he was 60, at a time when he could have been retiring. And I think this goes back to Gaylord Nelson's genius, and this is what I want to leave you with, that he left it to everyone to figure out for themselves what's the way they could make the difference, what suits their skills, what suits their temperament, what suits their life circumstances. And that might have been unexpectedly running for the state legislature. It might have been turning your billion-dollar business upside down. When he announced the sustainability plan, by the way, the stock tanked. And most of his advisors thought he'd gone off the deep end. They thought he had really lost it. And it took him several years to win them over. But again, I think for me, the inspiring but also challenging part of thinking back to Earth Day 1970 is this constant reminder that we can do a lot. And if we find something that suits our nature, then we can especially do a lot. And that can take all kinds of forms, but the real challenge is to think about it and to look in the mirror and say, what can I do? Thank you very much. I haven't heard about that specifically, but I certainly know that all kinds of people are trying to figure out technological helps And some of them are very complicated and some of them quite simple. And that's a major area that people can be creative, imaginative in thinking about. So that's a wonderful example, but I don't know much more about it. And I was supposed to repeat the question. Sorry. So the question was about someone in the Netherlands who had invented a device that would help clean up plastic garbage in the ocean. And it wasn't clear from what she read whether it had gained a foothold and was really making a difference. I don't really think about it in terms of confidence. Yes, thank you. So the question is, climate change is an overwhelming issue, much bigger than cleaning up our waters was or cleaning up our air. And in some way, it's going to be a challenge for the whole century because we'll have to adapt to the parts of it that we can't prevent, as well as keep working to prevent it. So the question was, do I feel confidence that we'll be able to do that? And I mean, in one sense, I do ask my students occasionally what gives them hope. And I get wide-ranging answers. And I also felt obliged when I asked them the first time, which was literally the last in-person class we had before the pandemic shut down the university in 2020 in March. You know, for me, I'll give you two examples of things that are totally unrelated to environmental issues, but they remind us how amazing we can be as a species. I mean, we're doing a lot wrong, but we're also amazing. You know, I live right in Buffalo near Delaware Park, and Delaware Park is 150 years old, more than 150 years old, and it's been through incredible changes. It has been damaged and transformed and threatened in all kinds of ways, but it's still there and it's still great. I walk there as much as I can. So the fact that we could create something that could endure 150 years of incredible change, to me, gives me hope that we can rally and address the issues that we face today. And not just climate change, we face other really difficult ones too. When I asked my class about this first time, I had, and my answer was, I like classical music. And I was introduced to it in college by somebody who taught us a lot about sacred music, actually. I mean, that's what classical music was for the first 100 or 150 years or so. And I think, you know, the Buffalo Philharmonic gets together every couple of weeks to play music that's hundreds of years old sometimes, as much as 400 years old. And they don't play it exactly the way people played it 400 years ago. They've reimagined it and it means something different. But again, the fact that something from 400 years ago could still be inspiring us today, you know, Monteverdi's Vespers was the example I was thinking of from like 1612. You know, we have been an amazingly resilient species. And we keep caring about fundamental things. That's what I love about the sacred music. It's really powerful. So for me personally, that's what I try to think of. But lots of other people could give other examples of other hard problems that we've overcome. But for me, I constantly marvel that we've survived and thrived in the spite of all kinds of adversity. In spite of ice ages, in spite of lots of things that, you know, none of us can really imagine. You know, 20,000 years ago, where we're standing right now was under ice. But I try to give a different way of answering. And I think most of my students feel this way too. I mean, they have their bad days. They have their days when they look ahead and they think, you know, pretty much everything I'm hoping for might be crushed. But the ones that really work on this, I think they feel like if the work is good and they're trying their best, they're going to feel at the end of the day satisfied. And they're going to feel that way even not knowing whether it will ultimately make a difference. It might not. And even if it does, I mean, as Ray Anderson knew, you don't get to a goal as complicated and challenging as sustainability or minimizing the threat of climate change without making mistakes, without doing things wrong, and then hopefully learning from them. So for me, that's the thing. It's feeling that it's something that's worth doing, and that you have something that you can do, that you're inspired to do, and you have the skills to do, and then that's the best you can do. So the question, third time's the charm. The question is, how do you deal with people who not only don't feel a sense of urgency about climate change, but may deny that it's even an issue, that it's a real problem? How do you talk with people like that? And this is a central issue in a class that I teach on environmental movements. And I have my students read it. It's really only like a 90-page book, but it's brilliant. It's called How Culture Shapes the Climate Change Debate by Andrew Hoffman. How Culture Shapes the Climate Change Debate. And he's a management professor, but he's been interested in environmental issues his whole career. And he describes himself in the book as politically independent. I've met him. He's actually become a friend. I brought him to UB several times. And the two things that are most relevant to your question, Mary, are on the one hand, the beginning of the book is really an argument that when people disagree in quotes about the science, that's not what they're actually disagreeing about. That they have different worldviews, different ideologies, that and that it might be that they don't want to hear criticism of the capitalism, and they're afraid that if we acknowledge climate change as a problem, we would be opening the door to radical changes. And this book is really about saying you'll never convince a person like that by giving them more scientific data, because that's not really the disagreement. And so the latter part of his book, the brilliant part, and I think it fits totally in the spirit of UU. The last part of the book is really about empathy, about trying to understand where those people are coming from, trying to figure out what is it that's really preventing them from acknowledging what you see as an obvious truth that we have to deal with. And figuring out whether there are ways that you could show that you understand their concerns, even if you don't share them entirely, so that you could at least have a productive debate, and so he says, for example, lots of people fall into the trap of saying, well, science says we have to do X. No, actually it doesn't. Science says we have a serious problem, but it doesn't say what to do. What to do is not a scientific question. That's about fairness, that's about economics, that's about culture, all kinds of other things that scientists don't know anything about, or not anything more than you or me. And it's about values. So you can say, you can accept the problem and not agree with my solution. But let's talk about your idea. How would you solve it? And see where we go. So, but again, that requires empathy, being able to enter into someone else's mind, or to draw them out and really listen to what they say rather than preach to them. We majority, but that may work tomorrow, but those people aren't going away. So if they're not convinced, they're going to do other things that you won't want them to do to try to stop you. But if you really want to bring people together, form coalitions, then you have to meet them part way, and that takes empathy. And my students, many of them themselves acknowledge that they've fallen into this science says trap many times. And for them, the book is a revelation. They love it. It's one of their favorite books, because they haven't really thought before that the science is the beginning of the discussion. It's not the end, and that what to do is a question that we all can be expert on, because it's partly a value
question. But it also takes lots of other kinds of expertise with scientific expertise to know, well, what would be the economic implications, or, what would be the equity implications, or, any number of other questions like that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.